Hey guys, our decline here, average picker. So welcome to part two of my tutorials on teaching lockpicking. A little bit odd, I know, a little off the beaten path. Part one, we just kind of looked very briefly at different types of learning ways and how people kind of learn and absorb information. And in this part two, which is probably going to, for the sake of time, get split into several parts, we're going to look at kind of start going through sort of how I start to arrange things as far as picking and things like that go. Okay, so keep in mind, I'm not making a claim that this is the perfect way to do it or anything like that, or that I'm really that phenomenal at it. I do have an elementary ed background, and I do have a lot of history and experience in training people and just doing instructions and things like that. I thought maybe I can lend a little bit of what I know into this. So yeah, we're going to kind of look at the nuts and bolts here. Again, this is meant for live one-on-one, 1-on-15. Your settings may vary, just kind of depending on what your setup is. You could be doing this at a bar, you could be doing this at a coffee shop, at a convention table. Maybe you've got a community space of some sort that you've managed to procure and you've set up and you're going to be doing this. So as far as like what you're able to project and props and everything like that, you're able to bring in seating, things like that. A lot of that could be out of the control, but you can still generally kind of use some of this stuff to piece something together, I think. So without further ado, let's start looking at things. So what we're going to be doing is kind of just going through printed out like PowerPoint slides essentially. And I understand you may not always be able to project something or whatever. Regardless, I tend to almost always make slides, whether I'm going to be able to print them and hand them out to people so they can follow along and keep notes, or whether it's just for myself or I am going to be able to project it. I pretty much always do it. And it's just sort of a way to help me organize what I'm going to say and how I'm going to say it. And just it kind of helps you stay on task. You don't have to do it this way. Sometimes I do it this way. Sometimes I do it as kind of a more informalized outline of just text, where I've just got kind of bullet point topics. So I constantly remember, I can remind myself and kind of check off where I am at any one point in the presentation. And sometimes I do it as an even less formal outline. I'll do it as a checklist. And I'll just have notes like talk about this, talk about that, and I kind of just check them off as I go. So you don't have to sit and just completely practice and rehearse, but until you have it down, 100%. But it is probably a good idea to go over a lot of what you're saying. And part of the reason for that is if at any point while you're explaining things, if you find that you're having to kind of go backwards or make side tracks and bring in new information, something's probably out of order in the way that you're teaching it. So it's okay to go backwards or off to the side and bring in old information for reinforcement. But what you don't want to be doing is getting to a point in your instruction and having to go back and introduce new information all of a sudden in order to get the people on the same page, if that makes any sense. So that's one of the places self-feedback wise you can kind of look for and work with. Pay attention to how things are going and what you're doing, and kind of make a mental note at least that, I got to this point in the instruction and I found I was having to go over and start explaining this other concept before I could fully explain or people were fully understanding what it was I was currently working on. So that's, one of the ways we can kind of self-evaluate ourselves. Now, whether it's projected or a poster or whatever, I usually always try to have something up. It might even be a little card stand, all right? I may just have a stand on a table at a coffee shop or something like that. This just tells people, hey, you're in the right spot, right? There's nothing else going on here. This is what we're doing. If this is what you were looking for, you have come to the right place. So the next thing you're going to want to do is introduce yourself and the topic formally once you have whatever the gathering is of people and you're about to start teaching them. And you don't have to do these in this exact order, but you do want to get these in. Who are you? So people know how to address you. why are you qualified to teach this, and what it is you're about to teach. Sometimes, you can mix those two up pretty easily. Why you're qualified to teach this, you do not need to go into any excruciating detail. I would probably just say, I'm average picker on YouTube. I've been picking locks for X number of years, and I'm pretty okay at it. You don't have to list all your accomplishments off or anything like that. Remember, this isn't really about you, but people want to know that they're at least getting information from somebody that is at least somewhat qualified, right? Or knows more about it than they do. So it's always kind of nice. And just to reinforce what it is you are about to teach them, you want to tell them again, we're going to be looking at the basics of lockpicking, or we're going to be looking at advanced lockpicking techniques, or we're going to be looking at slider locks or something like that, right? So just a little brief, quick introduction so people know what's going on. Now, I will quickly mention at this point, some people are often tempted, I guess, to go into why you might want to learn lockpicking. In a course like this, you don't need to do that. This is not a mandatory course. This is not like sitting down in a school or something and trying to explain to kids why they need an algebra 2 or trigonometry or calculus or something like that. They're not being forced to take it. The why is already covered. They've already made the decision for themselves. They've seen your sign or however you advertised it that, hey, I want to learn about lockpicking. So we don't really need to go into a why. You've already got a captive audience, and why is potentially, again, could deviate you off topic, which we want to make sure we're always staying on the topic. So we don't want to get into like, oh, here's why you might want to learn this. Maybe I'll mention, hey, it's a lot of fun to pick locks, and I just kind of leave it at that. But again, you don't have to sell them on the topic. They're there. They're sitting in front of you. They've already decided to join you, and they've already decided for themselves they want to learn this. The very next thing I do, I pull up the ethics of lockpicking. And I usually have something like this as a handout, or again, maybe have it projected. But we're stressing this straight from the get-go. And this is not exactly necessarily what I always do, but I think this is a pretty thorough 4 pointers. Of course, the main 2 we're concerned about is you do not pick locks that are in use, and you do not pick locks that do not belong to you. And I often will include this in some capacity, even if I just speak it, the security needs and the intents, and I cannot emphasize intent enough of others, must be preserved. A lot of this is what we want to do is we don't want to get hung up on this slide falling into the what if game, right? No what ifs. I'm not going to get into these, well, the house beside me has been empty for a year, but it is still owned, but the gate is open and the gate has a padlock. No, the intent of the others, the intent, you don't own the lock. The intent is there's a lock there. It could be put to use. We're not playing this game. If somebody is just trying to find a loophole in ethics to justify whatever action it is that they are about to want to take, they're breaking the ethics. Plain and simple. If you're looking for a loophole, you're breaking the ethics. And we're going to stress this. We're not going to dwell on it, but we are going to stress it. We're not going to play the what if game. Okay, so the next thing I often lead into is just with this very basic question: how do you open a lock? Sometimes I'll use this just slightly later, but this is very often where this appears. And this isn't really a trick question. It throws some people off because it seems like it could be. But I want to get people thinking about locks, right? These are things we interact with on really an everyday basis. And chances are, though, they've not put any thought into it at all, right? They just go about their day. It's that thing that's in the way of getting in your car or getting in your door or whatever. And so the answer you can kind of pull out of them is pretty easy. It's just, well, I use my key. Someone says that, great. That is exactly the answer we're looking for. Of course, you use your key to open a lock. And again, this just gets them thinking about locks and about their interaction with the lock. And so the next bit I go into is I just break that little tiny process down that they're already doing. How a lock opens. Well, you put your key in and you turn, right? It's that simple. What's the breakdown of that though is it lines up pins inside, which we haven't talked about yet, but we're about to, and you just turn, and turning is just applying tension. So what I explained to them at this point is really you're just doing this same thing that you do every day with your key, but you're doing it in reverse, right? So what you're going to be learning to do is to apply tension and then to line up the pins. That's it. So again, it's just about easing them into it and getting them thinking about locks, right? So this is something I sometimes go into about how, before I do how do we open a lock, I will go into the general lock types. Sometimes this list is a little more extensive, sometimes it's less, sometimes I don't use it at all. It kind of just depends on who I'm addressing, and what I think going into it. So often blindly, they may or may not already know. Because what I don't want to get too distracted and hung up on things like warded locks, lever locks, combination locks. I do kind of want to recognize, of course, that there are those locks. So I will oftentimes include somewhere right around in here. Sometimes, like I said before, I do how do you open a lock, sometimes just after, some general types of locks. I'll mention those off and then I'll be sure to reinforce this is what we're interested in, these pin tumbler locks. So we're talking about door locks, deadbolts, padlocks, doorknobs that are keyed, that sort of thing. Okay, now just to reinforce that, what I want to do is show them pictures of what we were talking about, right? So because some people actually don't know what a deadbolt is either. They know it as their top lock and their bottom lock. If you ask them what's on their door, they go, well, I've got my top lock and I've got my bottom lock. So really, bring hands-on examples. That's a good one. Often I will bring a deadbolt. I don't always bring a doorknob. You almost always have, if you're teaching, you almost always have a padlock on you. And I'll even bring in a handle set sometimes. But the idea is just to basically, at this point, give them a visual reinforcement of what it is that we're talking about, right? Whether that is a picture such as this, or bringing in, an actual example and saying, hey, here's what we're talking about, right? So we're just reinforcing what it is that we're talking about here and what it is that we're concentrating on, and it gets them to start organizing, right? We've got you now thinking about locks and your interaction with locks. Now let's think about what it is that we're exactly referring to here, right? So this is kind of the next bit I sort of hit at. I remind them of when I asked them just a few moments ago, how do you open a lock? And we said, well, we put the key in and we turn, which is causing pins to line up, and we're applying tension. And so what's happening when we put our lock in, or we put our key in, is we're lining these pins up. Now, I will often accompany, almost any time I have an image, I will try to accompany it with an actual real example, right? And I will always try to orientate the real example to whatever the picture is if I can, just so that I know that we're all on the same page and we're all thinking this through the same way. Because some people may have trouble visualizing that they're looking through the side of the lock. I know it's an odd thing to say, but it does happen. So we just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Hey, here's what we've got. Here's what's happening when we put the key in. It's lining these pins up across this core bit. Now, I don't dwell too much on this because we are about to go into parts of a lock, but I want them to initially see it without kind of having to put a frame of reference around. But they're like, they can start going, okay, so we've got these pin things in there, we've got this like core thing, we've got some kind of housing that goes around it. Just kind of helps them start to wrap their head around what it is. And we're going to look at parts of the lock next. So I don't have to go into much detail with this. I'm not going to get too much into talking about the shear line or anything like that yet. Okay, so now we are going to go into parts of the lock. And I want to talk about parts of the lock because I want to get everybody on the same page and I want to get everyone into the same terminology, right? The less I have to keep coming back and explaining the terminology and things, the better. So we want to go ahead and get this out of the way. And we're going to start it out at its most basic. We're going to basically point out that, yeah, inside each chamber, there is what is referred to as a pin stack. The ones that interact with the key are called the key pins, and the ones that interact with the key pins that are upstairs basically are called the drivers. And this is the only thing I'm concerned about really getting them on the same page with right now. I want them to remember key pins are your lower pins and drivers are your upper pins. Now, we've introduced a new photo though here. And so what I'm going to do again is I'm going to take out some kind of other visual aid, provided I can, right? And honestly, you probably, if you're teaching lock picking, you should have brought at least a lock with you, right? It would, yeah, you'd be kind of a miss not to have. But I want to again orientate them to this image so that when they see it, they realize, I'm looking at the lock straight on and I'm looking as if I can see through all of this faceplate stuff, right? And that's what I'm going to point out. Hey, we've just got our key pins, our key pin and our driver here, and it's like we're looking straight on. So again, it's about orientating, keeping it a little bit simple and making sure we're all on the same page and understanding what it is we're referring to. And now I'm going to get a little more complicated, right? Again, I've introduced a new picture, so I am once again going to show them how we're orientated. That again, we are looking straight through the front of a lock here, that it's pretty much just like that image. Just we've got a little more detail here. And this is where, again, I'm going to talk, we can introduce the spring. We're going to introduce what the body basically is around here. We're going to reinforce the driver pin. We're going to introduce the shear line. I'm probably going to introduce the shear line last. The plug, again, reinforcing what key pins are, and the warding, right? So now we can introduce the warding. There's those little parts. I'll often also show them a key and show them where the key slides through, allowing for the warding. And I'm going to come up here, and this is where we're going to start talking about the shear line and the driver pin running through the shear line and how that allows it to not rotate, right? Now, sometimes, depending on which lock I've taken with me or locks, I will sometimes drop a single pin stack into here just to show them all it really takes is one to be locked. Take out the driver, and you can see it still freely rotates. That's really just to kind of help if I need to reinforce, and you can even, that's something you could even pass around, provided you can get the top on it in a timely manner, because you don't want the pin stumping out. But again, this is just, I want to reinforce how this shear line works. That when that is clear and free, in other words, when it's hitting that gap, that it's allowing our core to rotate. And it's the driver pin that is doing the work as far as keeping the lock locked. It's just kind of about, let's get that down, right? I'm going to also point out, I like this image, but this is not the best image I have found for using this stuff. And I think something has to do with all this space through here. For whatever reason, that throws off people's visualization sometimes with it. As far as, yeah, I mean, it's a little confusing to explain or for me to understand what exactly it is that's throwing off about this. But I find images that are more filled in, such as, that tend to work a little bit better. But regardless, we've got the important stuff here. We've got this shear line and we've got our pins and everything. So we're good.